Okay, so we might get straight into our researchers presenting now. So we're going to start with David. He's going to give an overview of a whole range of the work that's been done, and then Elle, just so that you know, so that you know where different things fit. Elle will be focused on the work that she's been doing, particularly on vegetation and soil structure and its response to disturbance. So if you've got those particular questions, Elle will be coming to those later in the presentation. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for being online. I hope everyone can hear me. Rachel, yeah, good. Okay, so this is very much about the wet ash type forests in the Central Highlands of Victoria, and looking at a whole range of aspects of the research that's been going on for not only the last 5 or 6 years, but actually pretty close to 30 years prior to that. So in this presentation, we wanted to look at several things. The first one was the general changes in landscape cover associated both with fire and with logging. And then some work I know that's very controversial, but the data are now very strong about the relationships between logging and fire severity. That includes some new work on thinning, and then some work on the response of different species, leadbeater's possum and the greater glider, to these changes in landscape cover. And then we'll finish with a little bit of work on reserve adequacy and the spatial conflict between disturbance and reservation. And then Elle is going to present a whole series of really quite interesting insights into the plant responses to disturbance, including the understory and the contrast between the above and below ground responses to disturbances, which is really quite some novel work in an Australian context. So we're focusing on the wet forests of the Central Highlands of Victoria, and they are really quite magnificent forests. This is one of our long-term sites. You can get a sense of the size of the forest from the picture of the ecologist in a red jacket down here. They're also very intensively logged areas, traditionally clear felling or conventionally clear felling. And one of the big changes in landscapes across this ecosystem is to do with the range of cut blocks across the system. And what we have here in yellow is our long-term research site and how the landscape has changed in the last 10 or so years with the number of cut blocks added to the landscape. And you can see in the background similar kinds of situations. So the landscape context for these sites where we do long-term monitoring has changed dramatically, not only through logging, but also through fire. So what we're actually seeing is a significant amount of increase in the amount of disturbance just in the last decade. So this is after the fires. The last major fires were in 2009, although we did have some fire a couple of years ago that burnt in one of the water catchments. So the disturbance is increasing, but it's due to logging, not fire, because the last major fire was in 2009. And when we do the spatial analysis, we see that the distance from a disturbance edge in a log forest to an undisturbed intact area is 71 metres. So it's less than 7 seconds in the Olympic Games to be able to run from a disturbance edge to an intact area. In the reserve system, it's only about 170 metres. So there's no logging in the deep water catchments, and yet they're still even. It's only 170 metres to a disturbance edge in that system. So we're talking about forests that are now highly fragmented. So core areas more than a few hundred hectares in size in this system are by and large less than 200 metres from a disturbance edge, and that's declining. So this is a spatial analysis of what's happening in terms of disturbance in relation to years. And what we've also done here is look at what happens when you add not only fire and past logging, but additional logging under what's called the timber release plan. And so the analysis from this work basically shows the reduction in the size of the core areas that are a significant distance from the disturbance edge, and an increase in the amount of the landscape that is recently disturbed and close to those edges, as you can see in the red at the bottom of that diagram. So this information has been published in a paper in 2020, and it really does indicate the level of disturbance, but also the level of fragmentation in these same forests. So some work that was published last year looked at the extent of old growth forest cover, and this is what we sort of colloquially call the Sarah Lee analysis, where you put layer upon layer upon layer. So what we're doing here is we're doing a spatial analysis of the Victorian government's data sets on the different ecological vegetation classes and the extent of logging, the extent of fire, and the extent of recurrent fire dating back to 1995. And what we see is that in the Victorian forest case, through mostly through wildfire, but also some logging, is that we've seen a 77% decline in the extent of old growth forests statewide in the last 25 years. So this work was published last year in Pacific Conservation Biology, and it's really got substantial implications for a whole series of species that are very strongly linked with old growth forest. So for example, we know that the greater glider is very markedly linked with old growth forest, but also many forest birds turn out to be much more likely to occur in the forest when you have old growth or old growth elements in the system. So if we come back to the Central Highlands region, we now have 1,871 hectares of 171,200 hectares of mountain ash that is old growth. So that's 1.16% of the landscape. Historically, it was close to somewhere between 30 to 60%. And that old growth is distributed amongst 147 different patches. So you can see that the mean size of these patches is actually very small. The alpine ash situation in the same region is actually even more dire. So the amount of alpine ash forest that's old growth is under half of 1%. So there is a need to think carefully about how you protect old growth, particularly in a Victorian context where the definition of old growth was actually increased. So to qualify as a patch of old growth forest, that has changed since 2013. So it's now much harder to be old growth than it was before. Our analysis takes that into account, but it also looks at old growth under the previous definition. And you still have a substantial amount of forest that's been lost. It still sits at 77%. It's even more when you take the change into account where the definition was relaxed. Okay, across these wetter forest types, fire is the main form of natural disturbance. And the mean interval from Mike McCarthy's work published in 1999 is somewhere between 75 and 100 years, 150 years for the return of high severity fire. So what we've seen is that over the last 100 years, 5 major wildfires in this ecosystem, and that indicates that other things are starting to change, which is influencing flammability. So an obvious one is climate change, and we know that we've seen a 10-fold increase in the number of extreme forest fire danger index days since 1960. So that's a significant issue. But even over and above that, there are other issues that are important. So we can actually see what's happening in some of these ecosystems, particularly the wet and damp ecological vegetation class, which includes ash forest. So we've seen the number of wildfires here. So some areas are burning up to 4 times in that 25-year period, when these systems, for example, in this part of the middle of the state, should only burn about once every 75 to 150 years. So all that spatial analysis was published last year in 2020 on the extent of recurrent fire. And what we do see, something that's very important here, is that underneath the driving effects of climate change, we see that there's a significant increase in the flammability of young logs and regenerated forest. And so the shape of this graph is what we call a negative polynomial shape. And so for the first, if we look down at this graph along the x-axis, that's the age of the forest. And so for about the first 7 years, there's no risk of high probability canopy fire. Then after about 7 to 10 years, there's a very steep increase in that curve. So the probability of canopy fire, that's very high severity fire, increases roughly 7-fold at about age 40 years old before it starts to decline quite significantly. So what's actually happening here is that we're seeing what we call the intermediate flammability hypothesis, and that is that these young regenerated forests are very much at risk of elevated fire severity. And I've just put in a reference down here to a paper that's about to come out in the next couple of weeks in the journal Ecosphere. So the analysis that was published in Chris Taylor's paper in 2014 was from the Central Highlands of Victoria in these wet ash forests. What we see in the 2019-2020 fires, when you do a detailed empirical analysis of more than 33,000 sites, is we see exactly the same curve shape. So this is starting to be something that we're seeing more and more across these wet forest landscapes in southeastern Australia. Excuse me. So one of the important things that we've started to do, and this work is about to be published, it's not led by me, but Jeff Carey in the Fenner School, is that we see with climate change, we're seeing more fires and fires occurring at a shorter interval between those fires. And so we can look at the distribution of fire frequencies across the landscape in these systems that should burn somewhere between 75 and 150 years naturally. And then we can look at the fire intervals and fire frequency relative to the optimal saw log rotation, which is roughly 100 years to produce saw logs from these wet forests. And when we start to relate the fire frequency to the saw log rotation, and now this is important because recurrent fire in these ecosystems essentially prevents trees getting to an age where they're suitable saw logs. And so what we see is that the probability of a forest reaching an age where it's likely to be a saw log is roughly 20%. So what that means is that the chances of a forest growing to be 80 years old, so it can become a saw log, you've got about an 80% chance that the forest will be burnt before it produces trees of harvestable age. So what that means is there's a massive uncertainty of resource. And it really means when you start to look at the environmental economics of this, is that investing in the native forest sector to produce saw logs is a very poor financial investment. And it suggests you need to seek an alternative feedstock if you want to invest in the forest industry. Where would you get that feedstock? The answer is plantations, because you can get a harvestable crop from a plantation much more quickly, around about 20 to 25 years, than you do from a native forest. So this work was published in the International Journal of Wildland Fire, and that should be published within the next few weeks. Okay, so let's move now to the implications of a lot of this work for arboreal marsupials. And so this is a group of animals that we've worked on for 38 years. And the data sets that we look at here are collected in the last 20 years, since 1997, actually a bit more, 23 years. And what we see is for animals like leadbeater's possum, site occupancy rates have halved since 1997. And with the latest analysis we're presently looking at now, that's even lower. So we're looking at site occupancy rates well below 10%. And many of the sites that were previously occupied by animals are no longer occupied. If we look at the greater glider, the situation for the greater glider is even more dire than it is for leadbeaters in terms of decline trajectory. So we've gone from 64% of sites in 1997 to roughly 16% of sites in 2019-20, and that number looks to be even lower in 2020-21. Okay, so what are the drivers of what's going on? If we look at the middle column here, this is the relationship between the probability of occurrence of animals on this axis. And then here in the second column, this is the number of hollow-bearing trees on a site. We can see that all the animals show a strong positive relationship between the abundance of hollow trees and the likelihood of occurrence. And the problem here is that the abundance of these very large old trees is declining quite rapidly. It's halved since 1997, and it's on a trajectory to be about approximately 10% of what it was in 1997 by 2030. So we can also see that with the amount of harvest, so in the third column, with the amount of harvesting in the landscape surrounding the sites, so remember that the sites themselves are not logged, but the surrounding landscape is, we can see quite a steep decline in leadbeater's possum, a less pronounced decline in the greater glider, but still it's a significant decline. The one species that shows the opposite trend is the sugar glider, or I think it's now called Krebs glider, and it actually seems to respond very positively to increasing disturbance. And the curves are almost diametrically opposite of each other between leadbeater's possum and Krebs glider or sugar glider. The other thing in the case of the greater glider is that there's really quite a strong effect of the amount of fire in the surrounding landscape, much less pronounced in the case of leadbeater's possum. So this work was published last year in this journal, Animal Conservation, and I'm happy to provide copies of all of these as we have done already, and there'll also be fact sheets associated with all this work. So finally, what we've wanted to do is to look at the adequacy of the reserve system. And so in this case, what we've done is used species distribution models developed by the Victorian government, and again done another Sarah Lee analysis, this time overlaying the areas that have the highest probability of occurrence of those threatened species with what we see in terms of the timber release plan and disturbance. And what we see is that there's actually a very high level of conflict between those areas of wood production forest, including those targeted under the timber release plan, and high conservation value forest for those 70 threatened forest dependent species. So there's a high level of spatial conflict, and that work was published in 2019, looking at the that conflict between high conservation value areas and forests targeted for harvesting under the timber release plan. So if we want to look now at a summary, it's quite clear that almost all possums and gliders, and in fact half the birds, are declining quite significantly in this forest. Logging in the landscape is a clear driver of decline. There's a strong relationship between decline and the amount of forest that's logged in the landscape. Fire is a driver of decline for some species. Logging is actually continuing to fragment the landscape, even beyond the effects of fire in 2009. And that logging is taking place under the timber release plan in forests of high conservation value for threatened species. Now, other work also done within the hub, the Threatened Species Hub, shows that the current reserve system is actually inadequate for the majority of those 70 threatened forest-dependent species. So I'm going to leave that summary there, and I'm going to pass the baton across to Elle. And thanks very much, and over to you, Elle.
Thanks, David. So my name's Elle Bowd, and I'm a postdoc at the Australian National University, and I work with David Lindenmayer. A lot of my research has focused on looking at the responses of the Mount Nash forest to different levels of disturbance in the landscape. I've looked at soils and soil microbial communities, including bacteria and fungi, and most extensively plant communities and how they respond to fire, clear fell logging, and also salvage logging. So today, the focus of my presentation will be describing how fire and logging can alter forest plant communities, touching on some soil effects as well. And I'll base this presentation on summarising our key findings from our most recent publications based on the long-term monitoring data of the Mount Nash forest in the Victorian Central Highlands. So firstly, I want to bring your attention to one of our most recent publications in the journal Ecosphere. This study aimed to determine how plant recovery after high severity fire was influenced by the legacy of prior disturbances. So that's the age and the condition of the forest at the time that it's burnt. So to conduct this study, we compared the recovery plant communities after high severity fire in 2009 across forests that had experienced different disturbance histories. So this ranged from forests that were old growth at the time of fire and forests that were younger and previously logged at the time of fire. So the key findings from this study were that the age and the condition of the forest stand at the time of high severity fire in 2009 did influence the recovery of plant communities. Specifically, we found advanced rates of recovery in forests that were older at the time of fire relative to forests that were younger. So specifically, we found advanced recovery in acacia, eucalyptus, and also shrub species in forests that were older at the time of fire relative to forests that were younger at the time of fire. And one of the most major differences between when an old and young forest is burnt by high severity fire is when an old forest is burnt by high severity fire, we get this massive influx in biological legacies with really high biodiversity value. So that's in the form of these fire-killed trees here, and they're surrounded by this rapidly regenerating acacia and eucalyptus species. This kind of structural heterogeneity in a post-fire landscape is really important for biodiversity because it provides habitat in the form of these fire-killed trees, which often contain hollows supporting arboreal marsupials. And we also have this important connectivity in the landscape with rapidly regrowing acacia and eucalyptus species. So in contrast, when a young forest is burnt by the same fire, we find an influx in biological legacies with really low biodiversity value. So we see a lot of fire-killed trees that are quite small, and that's because these forests weren't old enough to produce viable habitat at the time that they were burnt. So in summary, these findings indicate to us that older forests are more resilient to high severity fire than younger forests. And after a burn, older forests provide a higher value for biodiversity than if a younger forest is burnt by the same fire. Another study published this year in the journal Ecology and Evolution further investigates the recovery of plant communities after disturbance, this time looking at how different disturbance histories can influence patterns of forest seedling emergence over time. So in this study, we compared temporal patterns of seedling emergence in forests that had only experienced fire, those that had experienced clear fell logging, and those that had experienced salvage logging, and we compared the trajectories over the same time period. The key findings here were that disturbances that were more of a higher intensity impeded the diversity of emerging seedlings. So specifically, we found salvage logging resulted in a lower species richness of emerging seedlings and a lower abundance of acacia and shrub seedlings. And this is relative to forests of the same age that had only experienced fire and had only experienced clear fell logging. We also found several species of common plants, including Elyria and Cassinia, and also acacia species, all important shrub and tree species, were absent from forests that had been salvage logged. These findings are likely explained by the compounding nature of salvage logging, whereby the initial emergence of seedlings after wildfire can be killed by logging machinery in the removal of fire-killed trees. Because patterns of seedling emergence can be indicative of the composition of forests in older successional sites, we suggest that this may occur in older forests. Another study that we published this year in the journal Forest Ecology and Management compared the temporal patterns of vegetation in young and mature mountain ash and alpine ash forests. We found that alpine ash and mountain ash forests had a similar structure and composition of forest plant communities, meaning that they'll likely respond in a similar way to predicted increases in fire. But we found quite stark differences when we were comparing forest vegetation in terms of whether they were young or mature forests. So specifically, we found younger forests had a higher abundance of plant species that were more flammable, and we found at the same time these younger forests had a lower abundance of species that were less flammable. So specifically here, comparing to mature aged forest, young forest had an increase in acacia species, which can be more flammable, and they typically appear to look like this in an early successional forest. We also get an increase in graminoid species, including grasses like forest wiregrass. And this grass species looks like this, and it just blankets all through early successional sites, and it's been previously associated with high flammability from other researchers. So at the same time in young forests, while we're getting an increase in these flammable species, we're getting a decline in more mesic species, including tree ferns. As David pointed out earlier, wildfire and logging are increasing the amount of young forests in the landscape with highly flammable vegetation. So these findings have important implications, especially in the face of predicted increases in wildfire with climate change. We took a more species-specific approach in Austral Ecology this year, publishing on the factors that influence the occurrence and abundance of the mid-story acacia species in Mount Nash forest. We looked at acacia species because they're an important component of the mid-story of forest ecosystems, and because they provide an important food source for possums and birds, facilitate connectivity in the landscape, and they also fix large amounts of nitrogen. While some other studies have suggested that these species may not occur in older growth forests, using our long-term data, we show that acacia species are an important mid-story species across all stand ages in the Mount Nash forests, and this is really important when considering habitat quality for biodiversity. Just finally, bringing your attention to another publication this year in Ecology Letters. This publication really highlights the complex and extensive nature that disturbance impacts can have in forests. Here we quantified how different disturbances influence soils, plants and microbial communities and their respective interactions. And here we also demonstrate how indirect disturbance impacts can be mediated through plant-soil microbial interactions, which can mitigate or amplify direct disturbance impacts. So the key findings from this study were that disturbance effects, so fire and logging, can occur both above and below ground. So they can affect plant communities and soil microbial communities at the same time. And these disturbance effects can be both direct and indirect. So indirect in the terms mediated through plant-soil microbial interactions. We found about 43% of total disturbance effects in this study were indirect. So this means without considering interactive effects, we can be vastly underestimating disturbance impacts in forests. And while an ecosystem might appear to be recovering above ground, this might not be the case below ground. For instance, relative to fire disturbances, we found logged forests had severe negative effects on soils and soil microbial communities. So for example, in clear-fell log sites and salvage log sites, we had a lower microbial diversity and we had lower measures of soil properties, including carbon, potassium and phosphorus, all key elements of soil fertility. We also found that salvage logging effects were the most adverse and complex relative to forests that had just experienced clear-fell logging or just fires. And this is likely due to the compounding nature of salvage logging, which involves wildfire and then soon after logging. Ultimately, our findings highlight the importance of considering below-ground ecological components and their interactions in forest management, which have been frequently neglected despite the important functional roles that they have in ecosystems, including carbon and nutrient cycling, carbon storage, and also in the regulation of plant growth and productivity. So just in summary of our most recent findings from these publications, we found that older forests had advanced recovery after high severity fire relative to younger forests. Salvage logging can impede the regeneration of some plant species, which will likely result in long-term changes. We found that more flammable vegetation is occurring in younger forests relative to older forests. Disturbance impacts can occur both above and below ground and may be direct or indirect. We also found adverse effects were pronounced in logged forests, especially salvage logged forests relative to disturbances that were only wildfire. And ultimately, our findings indicate that logging and fire are driving significant changes in these forest ecosystems, and they may have divergent effects. Thank you very much. That's my part of the presentation.
Thanks.